Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is Dawn of the Dead. Now, Dawn of the Dead it actually came out in Italy in 1978, but it wasn't released in the United States until 1979. Now, the film, of course, is written and directed by George A. Romero, and this is a sequel to George A. Romero's 1968 horror classic, Night of the Living Dead. Now, my copy of Dawn of the Dead is actually signed by Jim Krut. I hope I'm saying his last name right, but he played the helicopter zombie. Basically, in the movie, there's a scene where a zombie gets the top of its head chopped off by a helicopter blade, and this guy, Jim Krut, played the helicopter zombie, and I met him a while back, and he signed this copy of the movie for me. Now, the music in this movie was done by Gaylen and Dario Argento. Now, Dario Argento is, of course, a very famous Italian filmmaker, and the band Gaylen did the music for several of Dario Argento's films, but Dario Argento and Gaylen both did the music for this movie. Now, Dario Argento is actually the one who put this movie out in Italy. Now, in Italy, this movie was actually released under the title Zombie. Now, a year later, Lucio Fulci made a film called Zombie, but in Italy, he titled it Zombie 2 because of this movie, so the Lucio Fulci film Zombie is unofficially a sequel to this movie. Unofficially, in my opinion, the only official sequels to Dawn of the Dead would be Day of the Dead and Land of the Dead. Now, Dawn of the Dead is considered by many to be one of those sequels which really does surpass the original. Like, this is right up there with The Empire Strikes Back and The Godfather Part 2 and The Road Warrior and Aliens and Terminator 2 and The Dark Knight as one of those sequels which really does surpass the original, and I agree with that. Now, I love Night of the Living Dead, but I actually like this film even better than Night of the Living Dead. And one of the things I really do like about this movie is, even though this is a sequel to Night of the Living Dead, you can easily watch this without having to watch Night of the Living Dead. And even though it's a sequel, it also very much works as a standalone movie. Now, Dawn of the Dead is probably one of the most perfect movies ever made. Like, I love the crap out of this movie. And as I said, I love the first Night of the Living Dead to death, no pun intended, but I love this film even more. Like, this film, to me, it's one of my favorite, not just zombie films, but horror films in general, and not even just horror films in general. This is one of my favorite movies of any genre. Now, one of the things I love so much about this movie is it is a horror film, but it also has elements of other genres as well. Like, the film is very much a political satire. The film is mainly a satire on consumerism, and it's also kind of an action film, and it's also kind of a drama film as well. Like, there's actually a lot of character drama in this movie, and it's also very much a black comedy. Like, there's a lot of dark humor in this movie, but it all works very well. Like, it doesn't feel uneven at all. Like, it balances out all these genres: horror, political satire, black comedy, action, and drama. It balances them all out very well, in my opinion. Now, the plot of Dawn of the Dead is, it's supposed to take place, like, a few weeks after the events of Night of the Living Dead. Now, in Night of the Living Dead, you saw the beginning of a zombie apocalypse. Basically, there was a phenomenon happening where the bodies of the recently dead were returning to life and attacking people, and anybody who is bitten by a zombie would die and then come back from the dead as one of them. And in Night of the Living Dead, you realize that this was spreading across the entire planet like a plague. So this movie essentially picks up where Night of the Living Dead left off, only it doesn't follow any of the same characters from Night of the Living Dead. Well, also, if you've seen Night of the Living Dead, the way that movie ended, there was no way that they could possibly follow the same characters from that movie anyway. Now, the movie follows these four main characters, this woman named Fran, her boyfriend Steven, and these two SWAT team officers named Peter and Roger, and in the film, they're trying to escape from this epidemic, which is causing the dead to come back to life, and they eventually come to this shopping mall, and they manage to clear the zombies out of the shopping mall, and basically the whole movie takes place at this mall, and it's about these four main characters living in this mall while the world around them is falling apart. Now, as I said, Dawn of the Dead is an awesome freaking movie, and I actually feel like the character development in this movie is a lot better than it was in Night of the Living Dead, because in Night of the Living Dead, you really didn't get to know the characters very well in that movie, and also Night of the Living Dead only took place over the course of one night. This movie takes place over the course of what could be a couple of months, and you really do get to know these four main characters, and it's a very, there's something very intimate about the movie. You really do get to know these characters, and I would say that the characters in this movie are probably the most likable characters in any of Romero's Dead films. These four main characters, Fran, Steven, Roger, and Peter, they're all very likable characters that you really grow to care about a lot, and every time I watch this movie, even when something bad happens to one of these characters, it really hits me, and I know what's gonna happen because I've seen the movie hundreds of times already, but, it still really breaks my heart when something bad does happen to one of these characters, because you really get to know these people. The characters in this film they feel like real people in a way, and every time I watch this film, and this is gonna sound really corny, but every time I watch this movie, I actually feel like I'm a fifth person in this group of characters. I feel like I know one of these characters. Now, in this movie, I really like the friendship that you see develop between Peter and Roger, and I really like the chemistry between these two men, and there's a really funny sequence in this movie where when they all first get to the mall, Peter and Roger manage to get into a department store, and Roger says something, I forgot exactly what he said, but he's like, "Hey, how are we gonna get out of here?" He says something like that, and Peter's like, "Who the hell cares? Let's go shopping first." And the interaction between these two characters is actually really funny. But really, one of the main things that makes this movie work for me is the character development and the character interactions in this movie. And as I said, these characters are probably the most likable characters in all of Romero's Dead films. Even though Day of the Dead had some likable characters as well, I mean, not all the characters in Day of the Dead were likable, especially the villains of that movie, but I'll get to that when I get to that review. But once again, these characters in this movie are my favorite characters of all of Romero's Dead films. Now, in this movie, I would say Peter is probably my favorite character in this film. Now, Peter is played by Ken Foree, who would go on to be in a lot of movies, including several of Rob Zombie's movies, but Ken Foree also played Keithan's dad on Keithan and Kel. Now, one thing I thought was interesting about this movie, now in Night of the Living Dead, you realized that this phenomenon that's happening where the dead are coming back to life was happening all over the world, but Night of the Living Dead was set in one small location. In this film is also set in one location as well, but I feel like in this film you see this zombie epidemic on a much more global scale. In Night of the Living Dead, you saw the beginning of it. In this film, you realize that this is pretty much the end of the world, or at least the end of the world as we know it. Like, you realize that because zombies are taking over the world, it's the end of human civilization as we know it. So in this film, you really see this zombie epidemic on a much more global scale, and you realize that it is basically the apocalypse. Now, one of my favorite sequences in this movie is actually the opening sequence where they're at a TV station. Now, the characters of Fran and Steven are TV producers at a television station, and in the beginning of the film, you see, like, all the people at the TV station pretty much just going crazy, and some of them are leaving the place, and, like, they're trying to put on a show to explain to people what's going on, but everything's just falling apart, and just in that opening sequence, you get a real sense of the end of the world, of the collapse of society, and it's almost like you feel like that's what would really happen at a TV station if a news network had the broadcast news of the end of civilization. Like, it's a really haunting sequence, that opening sequence of the film, and I love it. Like, it's in my opinion, one of the best opening sequences in a horror film. And one of the things I really love about the opening sequence of this film, or like the first, like, 15 or 20 minutes of this film, is you see all these other characters, like, leaving to other places to try to hide from the zombies, and you get a real sense that there are all these other stories that could be told. So that's one thing that I think this movie has above Night of the Living Dead, is I feel like this film really does expand on the universe that both this and Night of the Living Dead take place in. Now, the film is very much a political and social satire, mainly on consumerism. Like, in the film, you have all these zombies trying to get inside the mall, and as the character of Steven puts it, they're probably trying to get inside the mall because it's almost like an instinct or a memory from when they were human, and Steven even says this was an important place in their lives. And even later on, the character of Peter goes that they're not really after them, they're after the place, and they don't know why, they just remember that they want to be here. So the film is definitely a satire on consumerism and the whole consumerist culture, like all these people who go crazy over shopping and material needs, and that's kind of the main point of this movie. And if I were to have a criticism of this movie, even though this isn't really a criticism, but I feel like the political satire in this movie is a little on the nose, where in Night of the Living Dead, it was done a little more subtle, but that's a minor criticism, and it's not really a criticism at all, because really, who gives a shit if the political commentary is on the nose? Who cares? But another point that this movie is trying to make is just how obsessed people can get over possessions and material needs, and even the fact that the main characters are trying to live inside of a shopping mall. Like, it's definitely a commentary on how obsessed and attached people become of material needs. And also, like, if it's the end of the world, you would think people would be fighting over food and water and stuff that they need to survive, but in this movie, when human characters start fighting, it's really over possessions and material needs. Now, in the film, I also feel like there's kind of a commentary on gender issues, because in the film, the character of Fran, in the beginning of the film, is not really treated or viewed as an equal by the men in the group, and it's not until she points this out to them and talks about how she wants to be included in the plans and stuff like that, that they actually start treating her as an equal, rather than just the woman of the group. So I feel like gender issues is also kind of a social commentary that's brought up in the movie, but the whole thing of gender issues is not as prevalent as the commentary on consumerism. Now, another one of my favorite sequences in this movie is a scene in the middle of the movie where, after they cleared all the zombies out of the mall, the main characters are just, like, fucking around in the mall, and there's this, like, montage sequence of the main characters just kind of having fun and goofing off in the mall, and it's a really great sequence in the film, and there was a sequence somewhat similar to that in the movie 10 Cloverfield Lane, and I would not be surprised if that montage sequence in 10 Cloverfield Lane was in some ways influenced by the montage sequence in this film. Now, the makeup and gore effects in this movie was done by Tom Savini. Now, Tom Savini would go on to do the makeup effects for films like Friday the 13th and Maniac and The Burning and the sequel to this movie, Day of the Dead. Now, Tom Savini would go on to be a great makeup effects artist, but I actually think this movie, though, is not the best example of his makeup effects, and I would say that's my one criticism of the movie, is that the makeup effects in this film really aren't the best, like, because in the movie the zombies are pretty much, like, they're just painted blue, pretty much. I actually think the best example of Savini's makeup effects would be Day of the Dead, but I'll get to that when I get to that review. Now, Tom Savini also has a small role in this movie as the member of a motorcycle gang. Now, Tom Savini's character in From Dusk Till Dawn, Sex Machine, was definitely inspired by his character in this movie. But as I said, Dawn of the Dead is a classic movie. I love the crap out of this movie, and if you haven't seen this movie yet, I highly recommend it. And once again, even though this is a sequel to Night of the Living Dead, you can easily watch this movie without having to watch Night of the Living Dead. But the film, I think, is almost perfect. Like, it's a great horror film, it's also a great political satire, it's a great drama film, it's a great action film, and it's also a really good dark comedy. Like, the film is thought-provoking, it's darkly funny, and there's a lot of really good character drama in the film. But yeah, Dawn of the Dead is a classic movie, and once again, if you haven't seen this yet, you owe it to yourself to see this film. Now, in a lot of ways, this movie became almost just as influential as the first film, Night of the Living Dead. Like, this movie inspired and influenced a lot. Like, as I said earlier in this review, the Lucio Fulci film, Zombie, definitely owes a lot of its success to this movie. Also, in 2004, you had the Edgar Wright horror comedy film, Shaun of the Dead, which was a parody on mainly this film, but I think that movie was really a parody on zombie films in general, but the movie Shaun of the Dead uses a lot of the same music from this movie as a definite tribute to this movie. And also, George Romero would follow this movie up with Day of the Dead and Land of the Dead, and if you count Diary and Survival of the Dead as being part of the series as well, those are also follow-ups to this as well, if you count those as part of the series. Now, in 2004, there was a remake made to this movie, which was directed by Zack Snyder, who of course would go on to direct films like 300 and Watchmen and Man of Steel and Batman vs. Superman, but I actually really do like the 2004 remake of Dawn of the Dead. People are kind of in two camps about that movie. You either love it or hate it, but I happen to really enjoy the 2004 remake, but I don't like it anywhere near as much as I like the original. But yeah, that's my review on Dawn of the Dead, and bye.